North Dakota is unreal. Sakakawea, mega giant.
Well, what's up, folks? What you just saw there was a giant northern pike Matt Doyle got with me in the middle of May, a few springs ago. Anyways, I'm gonna make a little comparison here real quick. So pike fishing can be a lot like my room right now. What you see right here looks reasonable. I mean, I got a pile of baits and stuff, but I mean, you probably don't think it's too chaotic, too much of a mess. But behind me, my room is a disaster. So all I'm saying by that is what you're going to see here is highlights and what to look for to find when that bite is really firing so that you don't have as much of a disaster. Because behind the scenes, I've spent many days getting skunked, many days struggling, and you're not going to be seeing that in this clip. You're going to see lots of highlights, lots of cool shots, but there's a lot of effort and work behind that. And with fishing in general, I mean, that's really it in general. Like, a lot of the best fishermen, there is a lot of days spent idling, and I mean days to have a good day of fishing. Like when it comes to good tournament performances, good days in general, just that good like intuition as to know like when to stay, when to go, when to switch, when to stop. That is developed with lots of time and lots of effort. So all I'm saying is if you get out there and you think, man, I suck at this, I mean, that's just normal because I've sucked at it a lot too. Had a lot of bad days. Just like my room, if I turn the camera around, it looked pretty ugly. There's a lot of time and effort behind those moments that like we fish for. So keep that in mind. The spring northern pike bite on Lake Sakakawea, which is what I'm going to be focusing on, is absolutely, I think, some of the most fun fishing I've ever had when it's firing. It is incredible. The amount of like big fish, back-to-back giants, some of the visuals of like those pike chasing and crashing in. A lot of those fish you're watching eat, you get like 10, 20, 25 plus pound fish. I mean, eating top waters, waking on swim baits, eating flies, some incredible fishing. And what I'm about to do is share a few tips to get you guys started. I'm not going to share all the gory details. I'm going to leave a few things out for you guys to figure out on your own, but I'm going to give you a few tips just to kind of highlight the fishery a little bit. Give you a few tips to get started and kind of let you learn the hard way from there. To get started, Lake Sakakawea is absolutely one of the best trophy pike fisheries in the United States of America. As a general rule, I mean, you know, a lot of the best big pike fishing is really out west around cold water bait. Lake Sakakawea, there's a lot of smelt, but I think a lot of the big pike get really huge from eating all sorts of things, but they really like keening on big Cisco. You know, so whether it's Lake Sakakawea or you go out west where you got, you know, pike eating kokanee, rainbow trout, etc., a lot of your best big pike fisheries are out in like two-story style fisheries where you have good shallow cover and good shallow structure mixed with good deep water habitat. The tricky thing is a lot of the year, some people, I think, you know, kind of get caught up on the fact that pike are always in like shallow weeds and stuff like that. A lot of the big pike throughout much of the warmer summer months are out offshore. A lot of them suspended. Like I'm talking, I'll catch them 15 foot over 50 foot of water kind of situation. Not the easiest to always target. And it's pretty amazing what's swimming out there that we don't even know about at certain times of the year that you don't always run into. Fall time and springtime is a good time of the year where those big offshore gigantic pike tend to like come in shallow, and it's a lot easier to contact those fish, and it's just a lot more effective in terms of like casting presentations, not to mention it can be a lot of fun. So we're gonna get started. This is something that like on Lake Sakakawea, man, like seems like everybody's all about the walleye. Hey, that's cool. Honestly, the pike are extremely challenging. I think they're one of the most underrated fish out there. Also, I think they're one of the most challenging fish to consistently target year-round. So I guide for multiple species of fish, including pike. I'll say pike are probably the thing that makes me the most nervous of any fish, because like they can be here today, gone tomorrow more than any other fish. Consistency is definitely the hardest for pike, and the spring bite is very inconsistent. But when the factors line up, it's mind-boggling. And I'm telling you, like, it's insane. So I'm going to share just a few things, not trying to like completely spell it out, but just enough to kind of pique some curiosity, get you going. So for starters, like I was saying, These pike are giant, some of the best pike fish in the U.S. You know, and it's important to take care of them. A lot of times when the big pike bite is really firing, you're almost not even catching little pike because I think they like literally get eaten or scared out of there because it's such an intense amount of like big fish in a small area. You have to understand that these fish are consolidated and they are susceptible, I think, to over harvest. Now, as a general rule, big fisheries like Lake Sakakawea and Fort Peck, I don't think are usually going to be affected in hurtful ways for the most part in terms of numbers of fish by harvest. That being said, big fish and top end, you know, giant fish, I feel like absolutely can be affected by harvest on these big fisheries. They take a long time to get that size. There's a limited amount of them, and certain times of the year they can be very vulnerable to harvest. And I think it's very important to respect the resource and to understand just because you're catching a bunch of big fish doesn't mean that they're as thick and doesn't mean that you can do that every day of the year. You have a unique situation where a lot of big fish from the main lake are filtering into a very small area, and it's very important to understand that and to respect the resource. So with that, starting out, I think it's very important to be prepared, to have some of the right tools and to have a game plan. When it comes to big pike, I would definitely recommend an oversized, knotless, thicker net. I use an RS Net Solo Slimer net. I'll show a little clip of it here in the footage. I would highly recommend that net. There's other good nets on the market. You know, musky style nets I would say are the most ideal, or like the biggest walleye net you ever seen in your life. What you're really looking for is something where the fish, you can net the fish, hold the net over the water, and that fish can literally swim around in a live well, so that that fish doesn't have to be like constantly curled up, wrapped up in the net for a long period of time when you're like getting all ready to go. That being said, be ready to go. Have your tools handy. Don't spend excessive time handling them if possible. My go-to for unhooking pike is a Baker hookout, old school hookout. This works really well at getting in there kind of deep, popping out the hooks, keeping yourself from like getting full of treble hooks. I like using a Baker hookout a lot. Additionally, with the really big ones, if they really choke baits, which especially with the swim baits, man, like I've seen it where like they'll literally have a bait like this, and I mean the tail is almost in the gut, like they'll swallow it, like it's incredible. And sometimes the hooks can get pretty far back in there, even with just single treble hooks. So in extreme situations, I forget what this is called, but I'll try to put the name of it up in the video here. But this is an extremely long product by Baker as well. That works pretty well. It actually is surprisingly good at popping out hooks that are really deep. Additionally, if you're careful about it, I don't know, with the hook out, you can very carefully shut the pliers, sneak in from behind the gills, not like wrecking the gills, but very carefully in between to turn around to hook if need be as well. Additionally, you almost have to really, especially if you're catching a bunch of them, have jaw spreaders. Jaw spreaders out of the package are going to come like this, and they have really sharp ends. To me, it's very important to dull them up because they're excessively sharp. You can dull them up and still get them to just barely shut. They might want to pop open on you once in a while. If you forget to dull them up and you're at the boat launch parking lot, you can even just kind of scrape them up on a curb and it'll suffice. You got to really dull those up a little bit or they're just a little too sharp. But this, if you have a northern pike's mouth, you put it in there, open up the mouth. Otherwise, like, it's next to impossible. Like, try to open it up safely and get that hook out sometimes. Additionally, with any fish, and especially when you have like thicker gauge hooks, multiple treble hooks, it's a good idea to have hook cutters. Popular kind of like premium brand is the Pxx style cutters. The main thing, like, I don't know if you want to call them like compound, they don't pivot just on one axis. Like, I don't know. Anyways, you get lots of leverage with the small players. Some of these come like quadruple dipped. I just get like the single dipped ones because they're thinner, so you can kind of fit back into their mouth better. I have seen people create extensions for these. That probably is recommended. I've been able to make it work whenever I need to cut hooks with just this. Usually when I'm cutting hooks on northern pike, muskie, anything, I'm talking bass, walleye, I mean, I cut hooks on a lot of fish. You know, if you get them by the eyeball, in the gills, I'd say with any fish, if you spear them through a gill arch, first thing you want to do is just cut the hook. cut it down as small as you can, and I almost recommend possibly popping it out, but I almost think it's better to leave it in there and let that fish's body just naturally push it out. This is going to be a little bit long-winded, but anyways, that's that. An additional cutter that's really good and a super high leverage players is the Manly Super Players. These things are beasts. The best players I've ever seen. They're very short, but you have incredible power in these jaws, and this cutter is incredible also. And having that 90-degree cutter as opposed to this, which is just straight up like this, can come in real handy every once in a while. So these are the Manly Super Players. They're my primary players for like tarpon when I'm like saltwater fishing. But anyways, having a bolt style cutters for cutting hooks is a good thing. If you get a treble hook and you just peg it in the corner of their mouth, like, and it's like impossible to even almost open it up, just start cutting. The hooks are cheap. These pike take a long time to get. You know, a 10, 15, 20-year-old fish is nothing compared to like a 50-cent or $1, you know, hook. So anyways, be prepared, be ready, have a bump board handy, get your fish, handle them well, get them back, respect the resource. That's the start. So now we're gonna get on to how to locate these fish and the factors that really line up to have this incredible bite. Okay, so the main focus for this video is gonna be chasing big post-spawn pike. We're gonna back it up here. Throughout the ice season, we're really backing it up here, jigging artificial lures for pike is incredibly underrated. I'd say most days, not all days, but most days, you can outfish dead baits by jigging. However, the later into the season it gets, especially like March and especially late March, etc., I do see that flip where it seems like I catch more on dead baits than I do artificial lures. Now, I mean, there might be some live bait options, but in North Dakota, there's not much as far as what they allow for like big live baits. Not a lot of availability. So dead bait is king, and it also works really well. So in terms of bait, dead baits are the popular choice of bait out here. Smelt is the most common. You know, about a 6-inch smelt is pretty hard to beat for a dead bait. Anyways, so they tend to get finicky. So even though I think a lot of people think at late ice they're like getting more active, I mean, I'm not going to say they're not active, but I almost think they're getting more finicky, but you get more fish consolidating into certain areas. So it's not necessarily that they're more aggressive. I think it's just that they're, you know, there's more of them in a small area at times. So as the ice goes out, especially on a reservoir like Lake Sakakawea, there's a lot of change. Water levels are changing rapidly. Water color is changing rapidly. Water temperature is changing rapidly. It is not easy right away at ice out, especially on the extreme west end, like from Newtown to Williston. That section can tend to get really muddy in general. And I'd say as a general rule, muddy water, not good, especially for throwing artificial lures. When it comes to dead baits, you can still catch the fish, but as a general rule for pike fishing, you definitely want the water clarity stable or clearing. And if it's muddy, it's just not ideal. So if it's muddy, the lake is big. A lot of times you might have to travel to different areas of the lake to really have a prime bite, especially with artificial lures. Anyways, at ice out, dead smelt can still be one of the best producers for myself through the spawn. That being said, artificial lures can play a role. I tend to go smaller. Something like a lipless crankbait is one of those odd lures that works really well in cold water for a lot of fish. This is a Simcoe lipless crankbait by Nishini Lure Works. A couple of weeks ago, even like late February, there was a spot in North Dakota I was actually casting for pike and did really well with that bait for small pike that were kind of in this pre-spawn staging area where there's a little bit of open water actually. So anyways, catching a bunch on a lipless crank. And another bait that I really like, you know, from ice out till a spawn is a jerk bait. This is a Duo Realis 120 SP. It's a suspending bait approximately, and you can see I put suspend dots on the belly to alter if I want it to sink very slowly, suspend, or float. This is a Nishini Lure Works shallow diver jerk bait. It's the Erie 115. This one has a lead weight on the front eyelet, which you can trim to adjust your sink rate. If you remove it, it's a slow float, and you can cut it to get it to suspend or leave it to have a slow sink. Having adjustable jerk baits is an incredible tool, something I use a lot. Jerk baits and getting that, you know, getting them to float or sink at various rates is a very important tool that I use throughout the year. And at ice out, a jerkbait is a very effective tool at catching these pike. And having the ability to alter, like if they're a little bit deeper, a little bit shallower, to alter their float or sink rate is like a very, very key option. So now, as we go from kind of that ice out period, oh, also what I'm going to throw in too, small flies can be a great ice out item, as well as small swim baits. You know, this is kind of a brightly colored rabbit strip fly, which I really like for ice out pike. You know, I'd say smaller to mid-sized flies in general. This is just a production fly, a whistler jig style fly, kind of like a clouser style pattern called a whistler. Just bought that off the shelf. It's actually got a good hook on it. But small rabbit strips are probably my go-to. I feel like I got a lot of purples and chartreuses for some reason, but it's actually a tarpon toad style pattern, which I'll literally use for tarpon. But good ice out pike fly. When it comes to the smaller baits, the bite tippet, you really need like some sort of bite tippet with pike fishing. Otherwise, they tend to just bite your lures off like nothing. Not ideal for your pocketbook in terms of like buying lures, and it's not healthy for the fish. Just if they're biting, you know, stuff off excessively, you really need to adjust something. My preference is American fishing wire, nylon coated American fishing wire. This happens to be what they call like 20-pound size. I'm usually using something that 20 to 40 pound range for like usually about 20 or 30 for smaller lures and flies. And I'll use a 4-turn clinch knot if I'm tying direct. You know, tight knot to like a swivel or to a snap. But if I'm tying to a fly and I want a loop knot, I'll use a non-slip loop knot or a perfection loop knot. For clips, when it comes to small lures, I really like the Tactical Angler style clip. It looks like a paper clip, and this is the small one. It's a little 25, they call it the 25-pound clip, I believe is what they listed as. But it's very sturdy, and it's very easy to change out baits in most instances. I've seen a lot of different styles of snaps fail. I don't have a strong trust in a lot of them, so that's my preferred snap. That style snap, I use that in larger sizes for the bigger pike, and I use them even for saltwater and stuff too. But for the small finesse baits, I like the 25-pound Tactical Angler clip with about 20-pound American fishing wire, 20 or 30-pound, depending on like how strong your tackle is. Okay, so in talking about pre-spawn pike, generally I'm not fishing them a whole lot, or it's like immediately at ice out. And I mean, honestly, like a lot of times there's ice floating around on the lake when I'm targeting them. It's commonly been from shore, sometimes on some of the feeder, you know, creeks, things like that, or just like some of the bays, you know, just casting out. Like you could land your lure pretty much on the ice and pull it off the ice. Once the ice goes out, I've seen a few things that make it a little confusing to pin when a lot of them are spawning. That being said, I've gone out intentionally looking for them, scouting, trying to find spawning pike, and I have literally found spawning pike on a couple occasions. This one in particular, I got some video here I'll show you from up above of pike spawning. The water was about 40 degrees. I got it on the temp gauge on this next clip I'll show you here. And this was at the end of April in 2021. It was like April 25th or 26th or something like that. Water was like 40 or 42 degrees. So yeah, what you see here, you know, first was the view of the pike spawning up above. Something that's also kind of cool is my Garmin Live Scope. I put it on perspective mode, and you can see those same pikes swimming around on the perspective mode. I tried to just stay, you know, back a little bit. Tried to watch. I didn't try to like muddy up the area too much. Try to let them do their thing, have a successful spawn, but I was trying to watch it. It's very cool to watch. I didn't even try casting. I mean, I don't think they would really cared a whole lot. That day in particular, I didn't really do a lot of casting. I burned probably 3/4 of a tank of gas just driving all over, trying to find spots, because year to year, as water levels fluctuate, these spots are ever changing, and I'm always learning. So anyways, these particular pike, I think were spawning, I'd have to remember exactly, but I think a lot of what they were spawning in, and you can see little clumps on the perspective mode, was clumps of curly leaf pondweed. Curly leaf pondweed is like kind of a plant that starts growing at late ice, and is a really key thing that they seek out at times. There's some other things they like to spawn in as well, but as a general rule, pike are looking to spawn in some sort of vegetation. That vegetation could be flooded grass. Like grass could be kind of figurative for like any type of like vegetation, but like a lot of times like literally just flooded grass. Like if you have high water and it floods out the bank and it's flooded grass, like brown junk, they might spawn in that. There's other types of grass they'll spawn in, like underwater vegetation, submergent vegetation, stuff like that. Curly leaf pondweed is just one of them I'm going to mention. Curly leaf pondweed is one that they like. It tends to grow in a little bit muddier bottom bays that are protected from the wind. As a general rule, most of the vegetation on Sakakawea is going to grow in areas that are a little bit more protected from the wind. Also, usually in areas that aren't excessively muddy all the time. So like the west end of the lake doesn't have much for any vegetation growing. As you go further east, there tends to be a little bit more and more in areas. Some of those bays that have curly leaf pondweed coming up under the ice are key spots to look. You can see what it looked like on the perspective mode. I'll also show you on side imaging what it can look like. Now what I'll say is you might have a fairly large bay with lots of areas with little patches and clumps of curly leaf pondweed, along with like, I think there's like elodea and various forms of like milfoil, and other stuff I'm not going to mention, that the pike will seek out. The interesting thing is you might have patches of this stuff all over, but there's kind of like a king patch, and you don't know that until you just kind of figure it out. And that king patch, I mean, that's like the spot to be. And you might have stuff all over, and for some reason there's something that they really gravitate to. Something to keep in mind too, leading up to the spawn and just after the spawn, ultimately they're all out to eat. The spawn is just a small little like side thing, you know, but when it comes to like pre-spawn, you know, post-spawn, if there's not food around, they're out of there. So then even at like that late ice and, you know, post ice, like for the most part, they're still looking for like areas and opportunities to feed hard up until the spawn. It's just, if it happens to be near spawning grounds, plus. And if there's good feeding opportunities by the spawning grounds after they spawn, that's when they stick around. So anyways, I'd say they're commonly spawning kind of in that low to mid 40s range. That being said, I have caught, you know, males milting, you know, up to like mid to upper 50s or 60 almost. Like, so I don't know if there's females like kind of continually coming in. You know, I've caught pike, you know, with water temps in, you know, probably in the 50-degree range. You net them and you pull them out and they're spilling eggs. For the most part, I'm usually trying to target the post-spawn pike, but you know, every once in a while, like I think there's some of those out in the middle of nowhere in the lake that just all of a sudden come in. So yeah, anyways, it's kind of cool though just to view that and literally see the clumps of vegetation that they're choosing to spawn in. Remembering that year to year water levels have a big influence in this, because if the water levels go high and dry for a while, you might have good vegetation that goes high and dry, or water levels come up, things like that. So it's very hard to like time it all. Some of it's like terrestrial vegetation that's flooding out that they're utilizing. Other years, curly leaf pondweed. Other years, other styles of like vegetation. But you're usually looking for vegetation, and usually they're going to be spawning kind of that 40-degree range somewhere. I think there's more variation. I think they spawn later than some people would think too at times. Like I'm talking middle to late May even maybe at times, but I think a lot of it's going down late April in vegetation. So at that point, if, as a general rule, if water levels are high, if the overall lake is high, but what I mean by high, I think more than just being like extremely high, I think if you got years where it's consistently dropping, or like springs where it's dropping all spring, not so good. If you have it where it's like increasing and you have lots of flooded vegetation, if last year's grass that was growing on the bank is flooded out, the more of that type of stuff is going on, the better and longer that spring pike bite is probably going to be. You know, if like this year, for example, like in Williston and, you know, various spots, we've had some snow throughout the year, you know, and a little bit of melt here and there. I think we're probably still going to be getting a fair amount on and off through March. Years where there's not much snow at all, seem to be really good late ice bites because it doesn't mud out, you know, at late ice. But the years where there gets to be more snow, the late ice bite can be a little trickier because that melting snow can kind of muddy up those bays. But it can really encourage a strong post-spawn bite because as those creeks get a lot of water, it draws a lot of fish into those like bays that have those strong creeks. And there's more that come in, there's more that stay, and as that water is coming up, it's just drawing lots of fish in. Not only the pike, but their food. There's a lot of cisco that actually come in real shallow, I think, in the evenings, particularly feed on bugs and like small plankton, little minnows that are back in those creeks. Additionally, you have sucker spawns going on in like that 40 or low 50 degree, you know, I forget when suckers spawn, but there's a lot of suckers that spawn too. I think people forget there's a lot of suckers in Lake Sakakawea too. You don't see them, and then all of a sudden they're spawning, and there's areas where they're all over the place. But the gist is those pike are doing the dirty, you know, that 40 degree range. And if that water is steadily rising, if that clarity isn't going to like complete mud, if there's lots of food around, and I'm talking smallmouth bass coming in to spawn, I'm talking suckers coming in to spawn, I'm talking cisco coming in the evenings to like feed on little bugs, they're gonna stick around. I think the key when this really kicks off, it's kind of that, you know, 48, 50 degree range. And what I talk about with 48, 50 degree range, what I've said, like if your trolling motor's in the water and you have a temperature probe on your trolling motor, if it says 48 to 50 degrees and you have steady or clearing water, and especially if you have a bright sunny day, like not necessarily excessively hot, but a nice warm sunny day, that afternoon, that evening, watch out because it's going to be on, and in a serious way. So I said usually that 48, 50 degree range kind of kicks it off up through the low to, you know, maybe mid 60s, but you know, I'd say really that 50 to 60 degree range is key. Usually I'd say it's kicking off approximately mid-May, maybe a little earlier, but I'd say approximately May 10th to May 15th through maybe June 10th or June 15th. That being said, there's a lot of variables. If it gets super hot, super fast, a lot of times they just head out to the deep. If you got good, like, you know, 55, 60 degree water, you know, throughout that range, lots, you know, steadily rising water without it getting too muddy, you know, and just lots of activity in shallow. Something I've found, which is like oddly, you know, consistent, is it seems like when the pike bite really turns on shallow is the same point I'm catching the smallmouth really shallow, about 50 degrees. So it's kind of funny because a lot of times if I'm trying to figure out where the pike are at, a lot of times if the pike want to move back into some shallow bays, or if the bass do, a lot of times they're staging just a little bit deeper. And if I'm catching them just a little bit deeper, a lot of times I'm catching those pike a little bit deeper too. But it seems like when those smallmouth flood the shallows in the back, when they first do it like at like the 50 degree range, the pike do also. So it seems like, oddly enough, like I can almost fish for smallmouth. And if the smallmouth are fired up in these back shallow bays, a lot of times the pike are also. So anyways, yeah, like I said, something to look for. Stable, clearing water ideally, but rising water. It's kind of hard to have hand in hand. The biggest thing is you want some clarity. Some clarity could be this, or it could be 3-4 foot. Like I said, if you have a bright colored lure and you can't see it 6 inches down, probably going to be tough. If you can see it a foot or more, probably not too bad. If you get a big rainstorm the night before and it muds out, probably not worth going. 4 days later, it's starting to clear up, probably worth going. Is it a nice sunny day? Probably worth going. Additionally, something I noticed in terms of just like visual cues on shore, a lot of times when the bite's really picking up is when the grass on the banks starts greening up. Kind of more of a correlation than anything, but like it seems like when it's brown and everything's dead, isn't quite on, and when it starts getting green is when it really kicks off that bite. Kind of just this one of those things like, you know, if you're looking around the lake and like the grass around the lake starting to get just a little bit of green to it, it's usually when the bite's starting to pick up. Okay, what's up, folks? I'm back. Since I was last talking to you, I put the same clothes on, but I'm actually days after I was just filming that last segment. A lot's been happening in life. Had to do a bunch of spontaneous things, and anyways, I'm back with you now to finish this long, drawn-out pike video. Interestingly, since I last talked to you, I said we've been getting decent snow on and off. We just got like a foot of snow in Williston, and quite a bit throughout North Dakota in general. As it looks right now, I would say more than likely, lots of snow plays a big role in how the spring and early summer pans out. And I'd say more than likely it is going to be a good spring pike bite this year. The big thing, that snow, it gets those creeks and everything charged up, and it just keeps everything steadily rising throughout the spring, which draws in a lot of fish and keeps them in. Sometimes they're going to the back main creeks in a, like I said, a lot of times you'll have like a big major bay off the lake. From there it's broken down into smaller bays. Sometimes you might have main feeder creeks coming into bays, or little smaller secondary creeks, or little just drains where it's kind of like little ephemeral like ditches that enter like the backs of bays. Either way, a fair amount of snow means these streams will get charged up pretty good and have a good steady flow throughout the spring, continually helping things to rise, drawing lots of fish into the bays and keeping them there. So what I'm trying to say is, more than likely, I think this spring is going to be pretty good. That being said, steady weather is going to be an important factor come this spring. If it gets to be like 95 degrees like throughout the end of May every single day, kind of shuts the bite down, kicks those fish out deep. But if those water temps kind of that 50-degree range, low 60s, and that water steadily rising, it's probably going to be a pretty good bite this spring. So anyways, enough rambling. Been doing a lot of that today. I wasn't planning on this being like a super long video, but that's what it's turning into. So it's a really cool bite. Just giving you guys lots of things to think about, and hey, maybe it'll, spark some curiosity. Like I said, if you do get into the mother lode, just respect the resource. Have a good time with it, but respect those big pike. Also, if you hear lots of pounding and screaming upstairs, my kids are playing, having a jolly old time. I'm not even going to try to tell them to quiet down because it probably isn't going to work too hot anyway. So if you hear some random like bangs or screams upstairs or laughs, that's my kids. So on to lures finally. I think how I'm going to break this down is, a lot of times what you're going to want to look for is day to day, you got to let the pike tell you what they want. That being said, the clearer the water is and the deeper the water is where you're at. And what I'm talking about for this video is focusing on the shallow post-spawn pike bite. So shallow could be a foot of water, but you could also be fishing in 6 or 8 foot of water. A lot of times in like deeper flats, in these bays, maybe around some submergent vegetation, maybe around some sticks, brush, flooded grass, maybe creek mouths, maybe not. It can really depend. Sometimes major creeks are good, sometimes they're not good, or like the fish run way up them and they don't really hang anywhere where you can target them. But anyways, if you have some reasonable clarity and a little bit of depth, it is incredibly difficult to beat a swim bait. And my favorite swim bait is a Softail McRubber. That's just what I've used a lot. So I referenced this one in a video the other day. This is a 6-inch Softail McRubber. This is an 8-inch. This is a 10-inch right here. Here's another color I got here. Nice bright white, blue, and pink one. If the water is a little bit more off color, I would tend to err more towards some like high contrast baits like this. This is an 8-inch version and kind of like a sucker style pattern, like this one a lot. I really like the sucker style pattern and like these kind of like chromy, glittery baits. The biggest thing is it seems like if the water gets a little bit more off color, these chromy, glittery baits, at least in my experience, do more poorly. So if you're starting to think it's getting a little bit dirty, I tend to prefer something more like a sucker pattern or more like this, just something a little higher contrast. It seems like some of these glitter patterns in the dirty water, it's kind of like a mirror without enough light. It's just kind of like nothing. So if it's nice and sunny or a little bit, clear, I really like these glitter patterns a lot. Color is not that important, but I have noticed it play a little bit of a role in terms of like, clarity and just, I think, contrast with the bait and what the pike like to eat. So with this bait, typically you can fish a lot of ways, but when the pike bite is really amping up, I like to fish them fast. And with all these baits you saw here, like this here, this is the 6.5-inch. I'm going to go through a different video at some point here, hopefully in the next week or 2 or 3, and put together a specific rigging video for these. That being said, this bait, it has a big square tail. I legitimately think there's something about this big square tail that the pike love. I figured out about these baits from like European TV shows like you know, YouTube stuff like years ago, and I was buying them from Europe before they were ever really available in like North America. You know, and then they were sold, you know, ABOoutfitters.com. They sell them, but I don't know, they've been kind of out of stock forever. I'm not sure, you know, the availability you can get from them or not. Otherwise, you might have to order them from Europe like I did. There's probably some other good options. It seems like this big square tail, though, something about it. I don't know. They really like this bait a lot. So what I like to do is I have a belly weight on the bottom of these swim baits. This is a 1/2 ounce. This is a 1/4 ounce. There's little screw-in weights. I'll go in and explain this more when I go do the exact breakdown with this specific bait and how I put it together. But all you need is a belly weight, a screw lock in the nose, and then I like a harness system right here. So I'll take a treble from this harness and put it in the back of the bait, just like that. When this bait is fished up over their heads, there's like very little hardware exposed. It just looks very natural. I mean, from underneath, like if they're kind of looking at it from a little bit underneath, all they see is like maybe a lead weight, but there's not a lot of hooks dangling. Just looks tasty. When they come up and eat the thing, this separates from the bait. It keeps this bait in much better shape than you'd think. Like this bait specifically, I retired this thing. I bet you this thing caught probably at least 15 pike over 3 feet long, plus lots of others. The durability is quite impressive. The tail isn't ultra thin. It holds up pretty well. You can mend these back together with like Mend It, or melting them back together with torches. But anyways, for the most part with bigger fish, they literally inhale these things. They love these things. And you know, with the single hook harness, one thing I really like, having this back hook single hook harness, when they go to eat it, it gets them in the roof of the mouth, so it really helps in terms of not gill hooking the fish, because especially with swim baits, they tend to just devour them. But anyways, when it comes to fishing the swim baits, and when I fish them, they're my go-to when it comes to like trying to find spring pike. Generally, I'm making pretty long casts with the thing, bombing it out there, and I'm bulging the thing pretty much. And if you'd ever fish muskies or something like that, or like bass fishing, like if you're bulging a spinnerbait or bulging a bucktail, where it's just under the surface, where you're almost creating a little wake just under the surface from your bait, that's how I like to fish these things. During the retrieve, I like to make maybe 1 or 2 directional changes during that retrieve, where if you have your rod over here, you might move your rod here, so that as it's coming in, that bait will turn just a little bit to give it just a little bit of a directional change during the retrieve. A lot of times the pike will bite it at that point.
It was a freaking giant.
But like I said, just in general, covering lots of water, bulging this thing up by the surface is my go-to for pike. Like I said, in that 6.5 to 10 inch size. And you know, very weights, I'd say 1/2 ounce is my go-to, because I'm usually trying to fish as fast as I can. Or, you know, as fast as reasonable. This bait, it tends to twist hard side to side and flashes that color very strongly as this tail is kicking very hard. Usually when they come up to bite it, you're actually going to feel something, like it'll almost like startle you right before they actually eat it. In most instances, I think they come up on it so hard that you feel the wake of the fish charging your bait, and they haven't actually eaten it most of the time. I think they just come in so fast and so hard that all of a sudden you feel the turbulence from them pushing on the bait, and as they come in, it'll almost disrupt the bait, and you'll feel that. You do not want to set the hook then. You want to keep reeling, and they'll usually end up following it for a little bit longer, and then they'll commit and eat it. And you want to reel into it, and like usually, I think you want to have a slightly delayed reaction. You kind of like as they grab it, you let the rod bend just a little bit, and then you hit them. Also, they absolutely will eat on the figure 8 with any bait, but especially burning swim baits like this. I get a lot of them boat side. Unfortunately, like a lot of the craziest footage I ever had pike fishing, or craziest strikes and stuff I've ever had pike fishing, I really didn't have GoPros rolling for it, which is stupid. But I just wasn't set up right for it, or wasn't taking the time to mess around with it. But anyways, if you have especially like over 2 or 3 feet of clarity, especially if you're like over 3 foot of water, or I mean, like really, I start with this period, but especially if you're over 3 foot of water, especially if there's a little bit of clarity, like 2-3 foot or more, a swim bait is extremely hard to beat. Burn it pretty quick. If they're gonna eat it, that's gonna be my go-to throughout the majority of the day. If the water clarity is more like 3 foot and less, or you're getting really pretty shallow, it seems like that swim bait is just moving a little too fast, doesn't give them enough time to track it in that really shallow water. They like to be able to come in and follow it for a little while. It's better to slow down a little bit. A couple things I like, especially, and these work great in clear water, but I think if the water is clear enough, they respond better to speed from baits like this. You know, like this single hook harness. This is that 8-inch, half-inch belly weight. You know, I was showing you with the other one, but you know, once again, this thing just gets buried right in the back. So anyways, I use the same thing, whether it's a 6-inch bait or a 10-inch bait, a single treble hook, and the hooking and landing percentage with these things is incredible. But if the clarity is a little bit lower, or you're fishing like, you know, especially 3 foot and less, or it seems like maybe you have some strikes or you get follows but they're not committing to it, or let's just say it rained a little bit the day before and you've been on a really good bite but it just seems like they're just off the swim bait bite, I like twitch bait, jerk bait, glide bait type stuff. Something like this 6-inch Softail Phantom is one of my go-tos. This bait in particular is like, I don't even know, it's super old, let's put it that way. They're super durable, they work super well. It gets a nice twitch, and on the drop it gets a little, you know, belly wiggle on the way down. It's got this nice, you know, tail fluttering around back there. But it's one of those things that I'm not usually working super duper fast, but twitch. It gives them a while to like sense it with their lateral line, come on in, track it, and then get triggered by that side to side and then eat it. Where, you know, with that water, if it's a little bit off color, if it's super clear, it seems like they like to react to speed from a swim bait much more. If it's dirtier, I think something twitching in front of their face where they still have to react to it, but it's not necessarily moving 100 miles an hour, is key. And this 6-inch Softail Phantom is definitely one of my favorites. This one, I believe, is an 8-inch. Here's another one. Once again, super old bait. Another bait that I really like in kind of bait category in general, but if you want to call them like bass style glide baits, this is a Megabass ISlide 185. Super good pike bait. This glide bait in particular is less of a traditional glide bait in terms of the way I think of a lot of them for bass fishing. This one you fish a lot more like a jerk bait, kind of like you'd fish the Phantom, where you're giving it slackline pops, and just, you know, twitching. This color in particular is really good in dirty water. Kind of that higher contrast, kind of has a little bit of that goldish green glow, you know, in that dirtier water that seems to really, you know, attract. I don't know. This works really well in a little bit off color water for pike or shallow water. This is the Megabass ISlide 185. Additionally, in dirty water, something that can work super good, especially in skinny water, which this bite is sick, is rats, surface baits. This is a Savage Gear rat. Works super good in a little bit dirtier, really shallow water. Just crawling up on the surface, and you can have 40-inch plus pike just devour it. It's such an unbelievable bite. This big bill up front is what it requires to wake on, you know, to go side to side waking on the surface. It also can inhibit the hook set. And the hard part is when you're working a little bit more slowly, I feel like sometimes the hook set and stuff can just be a little weird in general. You want to let them eat it, kind of turn off with it, and then hit them. That being said, it's a little bit tricky with this bill. You really want to reel into it and kind of, I don't know, you don't want to just slackline swing. Additionally, there's usually a front hook and a back hook. I've extended the front hook with this, so as it's wobbling along, there's a little bit more of a free swinging treble hook here instead of the two singles. This front one usually is almost kind of protected by this, where it doesn't want to hook up very well, and I don't think it's necessary to have the two, especially with pike devouring baits. I prefer to almost have just a single treble if possible, not to get too carried away, because sometimes they'll eat them pretty deep. But anyways, that's something I've been tinkering around with, because sometimes the hookup ratio with these rats is a little bit finicky. This is the Savage Gear rat, definitely a great pike bait. A couple other rat options. Here's a PB rat and a Spro rat. There's a lot of different rats on the market. The main thing, they'll absolutely eat stuff right off the surface, and that slow, seductive back and forth. And a lot of times, some of these make like knocking sounds. You know, that knock, 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 knock. You know, other baits like a hog wobbler. You know, some of those slow bladed, musky style top waters would probably work really well. The main thing is something slow, seductive, you know, working up over their head. Definitely works well in a little bit off color water, like when you have 3 foot of clarity and less. You know, maybe 18 inches of clarity, stuff like that, and you're in, you know, 1 foot to 3 foot of water. Yeah, definitely a cool option. Another X factor presentation is fly fishing. Fly fishing is one of those things that can work really good in clear water and really good in the dirty water. There's something about a fly that's just different. You know, I think besides flies, if you're not into fly fishing, things like soft plastic jerk baits, big grub tails, things like that could be alternatives to flies if you're not into fly fishing. But especially like just after ice out, flies like rabbit strips can work really well, but they can also work really well post spawn. You know, some of these are bigger, some of these are smaller. A lot of this stuff I'm throwing on stuff like 10 weight fly rods, usually with the 20-pound American fishing wire leader, or heavier, kind of depending on my setup, usually 20 to 40 pound depending. Something that's super fun, you know, 10 weight, you could have at least a 10 weight if not a 12 or heavier weight fly rod, is some of these bigger, bulkier bucktail flies. So these big bulky bucktail flies push a lot of water and they're really buoyant. So what happens, what I like to use is an intermediate sink line, and that line will sink down, so when you pull, every time you're stripping the line, that intermediate sink tip, which is sinking lower than the fly, will pull the fly down. So it'll pull down, and a lot of times kind of do a little twisting side to side, and then float back up again, and then you pull, so it's like a dive and a rise, kind of, you know, like a suic or floating rapala, kind of like, you know, it wants to float back up, but that intermediate sink tip fly line wants to pull it back down again. And this big blunt face makes this bait want to like wiggle or dart side to side. That resistance to the big bulky face makes it want to dance side to side as it's floating down and up and down and up. They can really dig these big, highly buoyant bucktail style flies. They're definitely a lot harder to cast. I would definitely recommend, like, it's not something you don't do if you haven't, it's not for everybody, but you know, usually kind of like, you could do it with a 10 weight, but usually 12 weight style fly rods is what you're going to want to be using. You can use the tieable style wire for these as well. Sometimes I use straight heavy fluoro or mono. Speaking of which, when it comes to leaders for conventional tackle, a couple options. For the really light stuff, I do use the American fishing wire because it's thin, but it's strong and it resists getting bit off. You know, when it comes to fishing things like jerk baits. But when I'm fishing larger baits, something I've used is Cigar Blue Label in 130 pound fluorocarbon. This is incredibly resistant to cuts. I've never had a pike bite that stuff off before. I have seen pike and muskie bite through like 60 pound fluoro. I'm not saying you can't go that light, but I've seen them bite through it. I prefer to go heavier for sure. 130 pound Cigar Blue Label is very expensive. It also works very well. Something I found, which you have to buy in bulk, but I've bought in bulk and works really well for me. This is a 100 pound PLine Cxx. It's actually a copolymer. It's a nylon line, more like a monofilament actually, but it's a very stiff abrasion resistant monofilament. And what they label as 100-pound is more like the same diameter as like a 130-pound Blue Label. I'll actually have to compare the diameters, but this diameter is like almost, like, this is almost underrated at 100-pound. Like, comparatively, it's probably 130 plus if it was like similar diameter. So, thick diameter, very abrasion resistant. This, if you buy it in bulk, you know, per length of unit, is a lot more affordable than a lot of the heavier fluorocarbons. I would say that the Blue Label is more resistant to cutting, but I have never had a pike cut this off ever. So I've predominantly been using 100-pound PLine Cxx leader. What I personally do is I use about 4 to 5 foot of this leader, and I use an FG knot to connect it to my braid. So I'll have my rod, reel, braid. Most commonly, I'm probably using about 50-pound Suffix 832. I'll connect my leader with an FG knot, and then I'll tie my leader to, I believe it's an 80-pound tactical angler clip. I think it's the 75-pound size tactical angler clip. The tactical angler clip, I was referencing it earlier with the smaller baits. It's a different style snap. Like, it doesn't really snap. It's more like a paper clip. Very durable. For most lures, it's much easier to change out lures quickly. This has been my go-to for like barracuda and saltwater fishing, pike, stuff like that. The 80-pound, 75-pound tactical angler clip. So I'll have like 4 or 5 foot of 100-pound PLine Cxx to this snap, and I'll FG knot it to my braid. Usually I'll fish that leader all day long. If it does get nicked up above the snap, I'll usually cut it back and retie it. Usually I'm tying a 3-turn uni knot from the monofilament to the clip. Due to how thick and tough the line is, you can't just tie any knot. The 3-turn uni knot does work well. Anyways, what I like about that is, as opposed to a shorter leader, if the fish rolls in the line, it's much better on them because like that thick line, it doesn't cut into their skin. Additionally, you have a longer, maybe less visible leader than if you had like a really short leader. I do think it's kind of weird sometimes if you got braid to like 12-inch leader. I think they might notice that. Is it going to affect your bite and your catch rate? Maybe not. I don't know. That's my setup. One last thing to interject here real quick in terms of tackle. On the light end of the spectrum for like 6.5-inch swim baits, maybe the 6-inch Phantom or smaller versions of rats maybe. Something like a 7 to 8 foot heavy power bass style rod could work really well. With all these, I prefer personally bait casting style reels. You could choose to use a large spinning reel. Personally, they get a little bit clunkier when they get really big, but no reason you can't. Just because everybody uses bait casting reels doesn't mean you have to. So if you prefer to use spinning for lack of backlashes, that's fine. So I would start with something like a heavy power bass style rod, kind of. Probably something in that 7 to 8 foot range. Maybe something like a 200 size, bait casting reel. Like a Daiwa or Shimano is kind of my go-tos. I have some Daiwa Coastal 200s. I believe they're 7-speed gear ratio with 50-pound Suffix 832. It's to be specific, I guess I got some 7-foot 4-inch St. Croix Bass X rods. I think they're considered like heavy power bass rods. But anyways, those heavy power style St. Croix Bass X rods work well with some of these 6-inch, baits, or like the ISlide 185. If you're going to a little bit bigger baits, 8 or 10-inch Phantoms, and actually a lot of the rats are fairly heavy. Or the 8 and 10-inch McRubber swim baits, I would definitely start stepping it up. Rods in that 7.5, 8, 9 foot range are going to aid in casting distance. Also, if you are figure eighting at the boat, you can get a bigger 8 or bigger oval at the boat. That longer, you know, pivot point, longer butt section, longer rod, really can help you hurl out a long cast with like swim baits for covering lots of water. Also give you a little bit more leverage on the hook set. Generally speaking, I'd say 8-foot rods, maybe a little bit longer, you know, would be preferred. Your musky style rods, like a lighter than normal power, you know, musky style rod is kind of what I would recommend. Some of them just get to be a little bit pool cue-ish, some of the musky style rods. You want a little bit of whoop in the tip, in my opinion, for a lot of this like fast swim bait fishing, because I think it really helps them inhale the bait better. So yeah, something like a medium heavy style musky rod could be a good option. When it comes to reels, a lot of my go-tos, like I said, you could have like a 200 size, you know, kind of bass style bait casting reel. When it comes to the little bit larger setups, like when you're fishing a little bit bigger baits, rods that are maybe 8 or 9 foot or longer, I usually like to balance them out with something like a Shimano Tranx 300 or 400 size reel, or a Daiwa Alexa like 300 or 400 size reel. Those are my go-tos. All around 50-pound Suffix 832 braid, I think is pretty hard to beat for a main line. Could go heavier. I wouldn't probably go a lot lighter though. So anyways, thanks for watching. That was a really long video. Lots of info, just kind of lots of me rambling. I had no intentions of it being this long, but there it is.